Hello, my name is Dan Campbell. Thank you so much for taking time to check out the podcast. For those of you who may not know, QA Bootcamp isn't just a podcast. This is actually the companion podcast to the flagship YouTube series, where it is designed to teach people how to do video game quality assurance. There's a ton to cover in this profession, and sadly, I don't see many resources out on the internet to help people get started in this actually really fun profession. Regardless of pitfalls and downsides, I love working in the game industry, and I love working in QA. I've been in this industry since 2005, and if I'm still in love with it, to me, that shows how special the job can be. So while QA might seem like a bit of a mythical monster that nobody in the internet really seems to talk about, I promise that if you stick with me, I'll teach you everything you need to know, the skills you'll need to polish, and if the past is any indication, I'll yammer on endlessly about my time in the game industry, distracting you from the topic. That aside, I'm sure you'll love it. Welcome to QA Bootcamp. So yeah, I guess I'll do a quick introduction. This, ladies and gentlemen, and animals, everybody. This is David Abzug. Thank you so much for joining me on the show, man. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So, tell people about yourself real quick, if you don't mind, just like your background and all that stuff.
I'm a game designer and educator. I got started in the game industry back in 1990.
Ooh, you started with 19, and then everyone's like, "Oh God, how?"
No. I'm older than dust. I understand that. When I started working at a place called the BattleTech Center in Chicago, which was one of the world's first interactive VR entertainment centers.
That's back in 1990.
You and up to 7 of your friends, so up to 8 of you would get into the cockpits together, and you would drive giant 4-story tall walking tanks and beat the living crap out of your friends and loved ones. And then you'd yell at each other over at mission review. And the whole thing was in a themed environment. It's set in the BattleTech universe, same place that does the MechWarrior games. And we became really popular. And so I ended up, about a year after I got hired, I was the first hourly employee they ever hired, primarily because my last name starts with AB, so I was at the top of the alphabetical list when they look to hire people. But I'll take it. I'll take the geek cred that comes with it.
Yeah, exactly. I'd take it.
And I picked a call sign and went off, and about a year later I was running the store. And then 2 years after that, I was training supervisor as we started opening up new places all over the world, and then regional manager. And then one day in 1997, I walked into my boss's office and I said, I don't like my job. Long story about what caused that.
I mean,
but then,
like, if you want to tell it, like, I've had people stay on the show for 15 minutes. I've had them stay for 4 hours, or not quite that long, about 3 hours. But go ahead.
The Dallas site was having real problems, and they were stemmed from the general manager. And so I told my boss I was going to go down to Dallas. I was going to fire the GM, and I was going to run the store myself and get it back on track while we were looking for a replacement. And I did that for a month. And in that month, the site sales went up about 15% in 1 month. It was getting back on track. People were enjoying their job. They were having fun. And that translated to the customers having fun. And then, so after getting to know everybody for a month and telling them that things were getting back on track and finding a new GM, the assistant GM of the Indianapolis site, my boss called me up and told me that in 2 days we were closing the site down. And I needed to fire everybody on Halloween. And so I argued against it. Yeah, I argued against it and lost the argument until she finally said, "Look, we're doing it. And so I walked in and told her I didn't like my job. And to give her credit, her response was, do you want to leave the company? And I said, I love the people I work with. I just don't like the work that I'm doing.
Yeah.
And we had just started up FASA Interactive as a spin-off company to do PC games about the whole thing got started by FASA, which was a board game company that had BattleTech and Shadowrun and Star Trek Tactical Combat Simulator and a few other games. And the cockpits used the BattleTech universe. And then they spun off FASA Interactive to make PC games based on their IPs. And they were working on a game which at the time was called Honor Bound, but eventually became Mech Commander. And she helped me slide over to that side of the company.
Excellent.
As a starting level designer.
Hey, that's great. So that's how you
And
got into design?
that's how I got into design, and I never looked back.
And why
I
would you?
I I worked on for like 13 years. I made my living off of giant walking robots between the BattleTech cockpits and Mech Commander and Mech Commander Gold and Mech Warrior 4 and Mech Assault and for
Dude, I
all I
feel
know,
like
Mech Underwear. It was
well, I feel like that should be on your tombstone. Be like,
yeah,
I made my living with giant robots. What did you do?
oh, it was I got burnt out on giant robots.
I'm sure you did.
I finally started working on Crimson Skies, which thankfully had to do with airplanes.
Dude, that's a
Um,
legendary game.
it's the game I'm most proud of my work on. I did
That's what you should be.
combat balancing, and I did about a third of the different missions in the game, and I did the Chicago open world zone.
Holy shit! How have I known you for
Um,
so many years and didn't know you were on Crimson Skies? Holy
I
shit!
I was on Crimson Skies. Did you play it?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. I played the shit out of
Um,
that game.
do you
I mean,
remember
I
the
pirated
mission
it.
in the Lost City where you're flying around and you've got all the underground and you've got all the that was me.
Holy crap, man!
Um, the mission with the big Zeppelin battle, but in
Hmm.
Chicago,
Yeah.
where was like two big old warships doing broadsides to each other as they went through the
Hmm.
city. That was me.
Wow.
There was a bunch. Those are the two missions I was most proud of my work
That's
on.
what you should be, man. You should be. That's
Um,
awesome. Wow, that's crazy.
yeah.
But okay, but I do have to stop you for just a moment because
Mhm.
whenever we were working together, you told me a story, a design story that like kind of changed my design philosophy a little bit. And I try to do that every now and then. But you told me this story, and I'm not sure if you remember what story it was, but it was about balancing a particular weapon that everybody thought was underpowered.
Oh, that wasn't me.
Oh,
I
really?
was
Okay.
one of the people that got suckered in by it.
Oh,
Um,
fair enough.
we were working on Mech Assault, and Sage Merrill, who I think is currently at Bungie, was responsible for combat balancing. And what we did was we got together and played multiplayer every night to help with the balancing, also because it was fun. Um, and Sage, we kept telling Sage, the autocannons suck. They're terrible. They don't do enough damage. They don't compare to the energy weapons. You got to fix the autocannon, Sage. And we walked in one day, and Sage was like, "Okay, we made some changes to the autocannons. Let me know what you think." And we sat down and we played, and we're like, "This is perfect. It's much better. It's much more balanced. It works great." And I'd like to point out a group of professional game designers, okay, successful professional game designers. What changes did you make? He's like, "I had them redo the VFX and I upped the sound volume."
That's so brilliant. And that made me that
Yeah,
story. You telling me that story, like, made me realize that it's just as much about how you present everything than it is
absolutely.
the numbers. Like the numbers are, yeah, sure, whatever, but yeah, that I guess perception of power is just as important as the actual power.
Oh yeah.
That's crazy.
Um,
I love that
it
story.
was we got a little red, and then we laughed our asses off. And then, if I remember correctly, somebody bought Sage like pizza for the night or something
Yeah,
to say, "Okay, you got us.
you got to go
Congratulations."
hats off with that one. That's pretty
Yes,
good.
but
Yeah, that's cool.
Sage is an excellent designer, though.
I
Also,
actually.
I remember correctly, his beard's like 2 feet long now.
Oh goodness.
Um,
Well, that I feel like whenever you get good at a game design, you gotta grow a beard. Like that's just the way it goes, you know.
mhm.
But also you've worked for like Microsoft, you've worked for Volition, you've worked, and you know what? To be honest, like of all the things, until I heard about Crimson Skies, one of the things that like I thought you'd be most proud, I think you should be most proud of, is your education. You're not your own education, but educating other people.
That was something I fell into. Didn't I didn't want to leave Champaign
Hmm.
because the kids have friends here. Aaron's got a good for those who don't know, Aaron's my wife. Aaron likes her job. We've got friends here. We put down roots,
You got life.
and so I wasn't working at Volition anymore. Let's call it what it is. I finally got laid off. 20 years in the industry before I finally got caught by a round of layoffs,
That's a
but it
damn
happened.
good record.
So, um, and one of the other designers, um, Bobby Schultz, said, my alma mater is hiring for teaching. I think you'd be good as a teacher. And so I interviewed there, and the head of the department, Ethan, said, we think you do really well, but unfortunately, we've already filled the position. But if you want to teach as an adjunct for one class next semester, that'd be fine. And I checked in, and the problem is adjuncts get paid in stale cheese sandwiches. Um,
So
but I
about the
got
same as QA then. All
yeah,
right.
Pretty close, pretty close. And so it was like 2 weeks before the semester started, and I talked to Aaron, and we're like, okay, we've got enough in savings where I can try this, see if I like it, go from there. When Ethan called me up and said, you know how I said we already filled the position? It turns out he had to back out. Can you come in for an interview and prepare 3 classes over the next 2 weeks? Like,
Wow.
I've never taught before, but sure, I can fake it till I learn it.
As
And
everybody is.
that was 5 years ago, a little over 5 years ago, and I currently head the game design. We're one of the top game design programs in the country.
Really?
I've started up a master's program there, which is hilarious because I only have a bachelor's degree, and I'm teaching master's students.
I mean, I feel like your experience kind of puts you over that hump
Yeah.
a little bit.
Well,
Yeah.
we built the master's program on an industry basis. It's not in game design; it's in game development, and we
Mm,
bring in students to form an entire team, and they form their own startup company, and we have their own set of offices, and we meet for class 2-3 times a week, but they work 40 hours a week
wow.
on a game. And they hopefully publish that game at the end of the year. It's a 1 year, 12-month straight program. And so full time for 12 months, and then they publish.
That's great.
Because there's no replacement for, if you want to make games, there is no replacement for making games to learn how to make games.
Amen. Yeah.
Um,
I mean, like 30
and
years ago, that
so,
may have been different, like, because you had to like code
yeah.
everything yourself. But like now, there's like Game
Mhm.
Maker, RPG Maker. There's like, if you want to make games, there's very little stopping you.
You will get no better experience than making a bunch of games, putting them in front of people, and them telling you how they suck, and then you fix it.
That's fair.
Okay.
That's fair. How many? Do you have any
So
idea how many games you've shipped at this point? It has to be an insane amount.
it's actually not that many. It's like 12 or 15.
Wow, that's not as many as I was
Because
expecting.
I've never, with one exception, I've never jumped onto a game, spent a short amount of time, and then jumped to the next one. It's been
Hmm.
at least a year, if not 2 years, sometimes 3 or more on each game that I've been on.
And that
And
tracks
so,
because whenever you came to Volition, where we met, uh, they seemed. I'm not sure if I ever told you this, or if anybody ever told you this. Whenever you first came there was almost like a reverence about it. There's like this guy, David Abzug. He's been in the industry for so long. He obviously knows what he's doing and stuff. Like, I don't know why he's here, but cool, like it was really neat.
fooled them. Um,
But no, you absolutely came in with a lot of reverence around I guess the industry. Like you'd made a really good impression on everybody there, and that makes sense because you being such a veteran designer, they're going to want you in on sort of like the ground floor, like the early stages of the game, and then you have to sort of see it through to the end.
yep.
Yeah, I got a question for you though. Something that
Hmm.
I know a lot of QA, a lot of developers just suffer through in general, is that sort of like, I guess, downtrodden, lackadaisical, whenever you've been sort of just beaten down by a project and you just don't want to keep going anymore. Like, how do you get over that hump?
I will fully admit there are times where I haven't.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. There's once or twice in my career where it got the better of me. Especially when you had situations where like it was constantly getting changed because of instructions from corporate, or the schedule gets yanked in, or like there was a time at Microsoft where I spent 3 years working crunch hours, 70 to 80 hours minimum a week.
Holy
Um,
God.
and that was bad.
Yeah, I would say.
Okay.
Holy
But
cow.
the times that I have gotten out of it, there's been a couple of methods. Method number one is find a part of the game that I love and make sure that that part is as good as possible.
It's a good idea.
Okay.
Hmm.
Method number two is sneak in some fun Easter eggs. At least that works for me. Okay. Um,
That's really good
we had
tips.
we had one in MechWarrior 4 that actually got, if I remember correctly, got stopped by Microsoft's legal department. Um,
I mean, I'm
it
sure the
was
NDA is up. I'm sure you could say it.
Yeah. Well, there was the mech lab, but had a 3D model of the mech in the background because it was a 3D game. And if I remember correctly, the plan was if you took an Atlas and gave it a specific weapon loadout, because remember this is back in the late '90s, early
Mm.
2000s. Clippy would pop up and say, "It looks like you're trying to make a mech. Maybe I can help." And then the Atlas would torso twist and blow the crap out of Clippy.
How would they
And
not
just
want that in the game? Oh,
because Clippy was their mascot and it was Microsoft. And at that time, they had no sense of humor. I think nowadays, I think they would have been perfectly fine with it, seeing some of the other stuff they've done. But
yeah.
back then, they bought us in Bungie because they didn't know much about making games. And that's why we are Bungie and Fast Interactive. As last I checked, this could have changed in the last 5 years. The only two game companies that Microsoft ever purchased and then made them move to Seattle,
Ooh.
as opposed to letting them stay where they were.
Yeah, see, that was a
I
long
don't,
time ago too, wasn't it?
yeah,
Which Bungie wasn't that long ago, I guess.
no, Bungie was same time about the same time we got bought, which
Wow.
was 1998.
Hmm.
Yeah, we got bought in it was like November of '98 where they pulled us all into the kitchen and said, "You know how we're looking for a publisher? They bought us." Um,
Good news and bad news.
well, it was interesting because I had just gotten engaged, and so Aaron and I all of a sudden flew out. We had found an apartment, and Aaron and I flew out to Seattle and decided whether or not to move cross country.
I'm gonna guess you decided
Um,
not.
no, we did.
Oh, you did? Okay, so you moved
Yeah,
back.
yeah.
Oh,
We were in Seattle for about 8, 9 years, and then we decided we were just talking about moving back to the Midwest because both our families are from Chicago, and we wanted to be around family.
makes sense.
Um, when I got a phone call from a recruiter saying, "I have a perfect design job for you," and I said, "Really?" They said, "Yeah, it's in, I think it was Shanghai," and I said, "No, that's not. But if you find anything in Illinois, keep me informed."
Yeah.
She goes, "There's no jobs in Illinois, right?" I said, "I understand that, but if you see something, give me a call." The next day, she called me up and said, "You'll never guess what I just found," and it was Volition hiring a designer.
Perfect, man. That's
Um,
great. I can't remember what
mhm.
did you start with RFG or Red Faction Gorilla?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
started out as the multiplayer designer on RFG, which was very funny because the team was myself, Dave Ansager, David Cubberly, David Bianchi, DJ Herco, whose first name is David, and Stephen Horn, who we called David so there'd be no confusion. But
Oh man, I still know all those guys, and they're man, you
mhm,
got a freaking murderer's row there. That's a pretty
it
good
was,
brew of guys.
we came up with, well, Ansager saved all of our butts
Really?
on that team. Oh yeah, well this is Red Faction Gorilla. You remember Red Faction
Oh
Gorilla?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
The three big things about it were the open world,
Mhm.
the vehicles, and of course the destruction system.
Of course.
I got put in charge of, I got put, I was the designer on the multiplayer team, and I said, okay, come up with some fun multiplayer. The only things you can't use are destruction, the vehicles, or the open world.
What? How? Why? What's the point then?
Um, because the network load, the destruction system was so crazy that the network couldn't handle it. It couldn't handle it over a network. Except this is where Dave Ansager is a bloody genius. About 3 months into the design, into us trying to figure out how to do it without any of the really good parts, he figured out how to get destruction working in multiplayer.
Wow.
Okay, and then we came up with the repair tool, which was really useful, and then we came up with the backpack system. Um,
Which, to be honest, like the backpack system was so impressive that they, like, for the longest time in development, it was just like multiplayer backpacks. That's it. But then they ended up liking them so much that they ended up putting the backpacks in single player.
mhm.
Like,
Well, they were fun.
hell yeah, they were.
So
Awesome. Yeah, it was like almost like a just a extra bonus weapon that was just sort of always with you and never ran out of ammo. Like it's pretty great. But yeah, dude, I mean that just goes to show anybody who's watching, friggin' he was such a good designer that he got told he couldn't use these things, and not only did they ended up figuring out how to use these things, the whole team actually figured out how to use these things, but they made it so good that they ended up saying, you know what, we're actually going to steal some things from multiplayer and put it in single player.
I will just want to state for the record, I am not the one that figured out how to get destruction working. That was
Right, right.
somebody with a much bigger brain than me.
I'm not gonna go that.
Um,
I'm not gonna say that. Just let's just say a different geared brain. A brain geared to something else.
boy. Um,
But yeah, I mean, so yeah, I actually have a few just sort of canned questions that I try to ask everybody if you're interested. Do you have a favorite bug in memory or anything like that? Any bugs that you remember being like really entertaining?
I call this one entertaining. Well, there were two bugs in the cockpits, in the BattleTech cockpits. One of which was entertaining, and one of which was is frustrating as all hell. But it was hilarious how it got solved. The entertaining one was we were trying to get jump jets into the cockpits. Okay, so that the mechs could do these big leaps.
Oh yeah.
And the bug that showed up when we first did it actually was that you could activate the jump jets, but you couldn't deactivate them. So the mechs just kept going up and up and up. Okay, until eventually at one point you're walking along and you get shot from like 500 feet above you, and like, what the hell is that? The one that
God,
was
sniper
frustrating,
rifle.
and this is a great example of where QA is incredibly helpful. Which we did not have at the time. This is a lesson in why you need to have QA. We had a bug that knew when rookies were playing. If you put rookies in the cockpits, the game crashed. If you put experienced players in the cockpits, the game did not crash. We had some experienced players that we pulled over to the offices from the store.
Mhm.
And mind you, this was software in release in the stores.
Oh boy.
As the general manager, I was handing out free game passes like they were goddamn water, because every time there was a group of rookies in, the game crashed.
Wow. I can see how that'd be problematic.
We told people at the offices, play like rookies. Okay. And the game still didn't crash. Then we put rookies in and the game would crash and nobody could figure out why. Part of that was because we didn't have a QA plan. We didn't have a test plan. We weren't testing specific things.
Mm-hmm.
It finally got found when one of the programmers, Greg Corson, accidentally jostled the joystick in the test bed he had in his office, and reproed the bug while he was able to figure out what the hell was going on. Every mech had a numeric designation. Okay, every mech had a number so it could be tracked by the network, which, by the way, wasn't Ethernet. This was before Ethernet. This was a token ring LAN.
Oh God.
Was the style of network it ran on.
I barely even remember what that means, but go ahead.
Do me a favor. Put your hand out in the camera like you're holding a joystick.
Yeah.
Okay, now you're aiming right at something. I tell you to miss. Go ahead and miss.
Like.
Yep.
Maybe, okay,
exactly.
Like.
You go to the right or you go to the left.
Yeah.
To miss. Okay. The problem was the game would crash if you shot the shadow of the lowest numbered mech that was on your screen at the time. And so when we told people to intentionally miss, they were missing to the right or left. They weren't missing down.
Oh.
But the rookies were missing down and shooting the shadows.
Wow. That is bizarre.
Drove us nuts for weeks.
Like, even if I managed to repro that, I don't think I'd figure it out at the time. Like, I could probably make that happen 10 times and be like, okay, what was different? You know? Wow. That's bonkers.
It was. I think I lost half of my hair in that time period.
I've lost all of mine.
Well, same here, but I mean, I lost half of it then.
Right.
So,
the game industry, man. It's something else. Okay, so another little canned question for you that I like to ask people. So you have the unique perspective of being in the industry for a really long time. You've almost seen QA in its like birth. Like they say QA didn't exist when you started. At least not to my knowledge. But
yeah, go on.
No, sorry. Question being, is there something that you think that every QA person should have whenever they try to get into the industry, or maybe try to improve, or just like sort of those skill sets? Not even just one. Like if you could think of skill sets that any QA person really needs.
I got lucky and got spoiled by QA because Microsoft moved over their entire QA philosophy from Windows to their to the game development.
So they were established pretty well.
You had to be an engineer to get a QA position at Microsoft at that time. They wrote their own test plans. They wrote their own test tools. They were. I bowed to them. But what I would say, if there's one quality that a good QA has, it's easy to say stubbornness. But that's I think unfair, because I think you need that to be anywhere in the industry.
Well, and that's a good point.
Much.
Like if you feel like that's something that could help everybody. So what do you mean exactly by stubbornness, if you don't mind elaborating?
you can't let yourself get stopped by the first thing. I don't mean stubbornness as in sticking to your guns. That's a death knell
Right.
in the game industry. You've got to be able to look at evidence, talk to people, change your plans, find the good idea, whether or not it's your own, and be able to champion that good idea, whether or not it's your, especially when it's not your own. You need to be able to do all of that. But when I say stubbornness, you are going to get stopped at all times. You're trying to do a creative work on a team to a schedule. That is one of the hardest things you can do in a professional career. All right. Hold a shared vision across 150, 200, 300 people, even 20 or 30. All right. Maintain that shared vision and move together towards the eventual goal without losing track of things and without anybody sliding off to the sides. All right.
So it's like it's basically expect these roadblocks, like expect these
Exactly.
problems. Okay.
And so you're going to have, this isn't ready, this has to be, you've got to be prepared to be creative enough, not just in terms of coming up with ideas or figuring out cool ways to do things, creative enough to say, how can I keep getting things done despite this roadblock? What part of this can I still work on? Is there another thing that I could go be working on? You have to be successful in the games industry. I think you have to be a self-starter. And that's more important in QA than it is anywhere else, because all too often QA gets a list of things to do, and that's fine, don't get me wrong, but it's QA's ability to adjust to what they're seeing that makes them valuable. It's the ability. That's one of the first things I did when I was on RFG was we set up daily play tests of RFG's multiplayer, and I had Cubs and Bianchi as embedded testers, and they were part of that play group every time giving feedback. That's an important part. There's times where you have to listen to QA, and I will admit there are times where you should not listen. If QA ever comes to you and tells you the game's too easy, you ignore them because they play the game 50 hours a goddamn week. It better be too easy for them.
Exactly.
Okay. If QA ever comes to you and tell you the game's too hard, run screaming to your computer and fix it now. But
Agreed.
but more importantly, QA, I would say, if you want to ask the most important quality for a good QA person, communication skills is the ability to sit down, not just write up a bug, but to sit down with a team and go, here's what I observed, here's what I saw happening. And I'm not talking about with bugs, I'm talking about gameplay. QA is your first play testers.
And that's actually something that I think a lot of companies still struggle with today. Is like QA is a valuable resource, not just to find bugs, but also to know what's going on in the game.
Yeah, QA and level design, and gameplay programming are like what everyone thinks of as a starting position, and all three of them are vastly important. Okay. Everybody thinks that the network programmers are the great programmers, or the system programmers, or the engine programmers. But the fact is, a programmer that understands gameplay, and you can sit down with that programmer and talk with them for half an hour, and then she comes up and then she puts it into the game, and the two of you sit together and balance it and get it working, is a pearl beyond price. My favorite example, the magnet gun from RFA, which was incredibly fun.
Awesome.
Got developed because David Bianchi and Kevin Hassett sat together for a couple of days and fucked around.
Yeah, that's great.
And came up with it. And they did it specifically to prove me, and I was wrong, to prove me wrong. We were having an argument about which way, and this is a mistake I made as the design director on the project. We were going back and forth on what the magnet gun should do. I don't even remember what my idea was anymore because it was so goddamn cool once they got it in. And
sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead, but I do want to talk to you about your humility, dude.
Okay. And they, no. We'll get to that in a minute. And they brought up, and they were like, we should do this. And I'm like, no, we should do that. We should do this. We should do that. And I said, look, we're doing this. We're doing this thing over here. And their response was to go code the thing they wanted together in their spare time and show it to me. And I'm very proud that my response was, Yeah, I was wrong. We're gonna do that. That's awesome. We should do that.
That's great.
Um,
Yeah, and that leads me to the humility point. Is like, as this is more me speaking from a design standpoint, is how in the world do you not get defensive? And when do you know when? Is there ever a time when you know, like, no, I'm right about this? You know, like you have to put your foot down.
you, I tell my students when they get to be when they the ones that get, I don't form the leads on our senior capstone. I let the team pick the leads. Okay. With the singular exception, usually of the lead production person, because someone needs to keep that shit organized while they're figuring out the rest.
Yeah.
But the I let them choose it, and then I sit down with the leads, and here's what I tell them: you're working for 2 semesters on this project, and I should point out that this year's capstone team is 38 students. Okay. They specifically wanted one 38-person team rather than two 19-person teams because, and I quote, we want to have as many communication problems as possible so we can figure out how to deal with them.
That's smart.
I love that.
Yeah.
But I sit down with the leads and what I tell them is your primary job is to find the fun, is to even as to find the right solution and champion that again, no matter whose it is, and to build consensus to make sure that the team is on board with it. There's going to be times where where you're certain you're right and you need to put your foot down.
Mm-hmm.
I expect that to happen. If that happens more than once or twice over the 2 semesters, you're doing it too much.
Yeah. Because there's
Okay.
always that room for conversation and that room for trying to
Exactly.
find a middle ground. Yeah. And I think it it's such a thing to touch on before. Sorry, I have crazy bad ADD. So to touch on something you said before is the importance of QA and level design and basically all these sort of entry level things. You would talk before, like, it doesn't matter how good the game mechanics are if it's just in an empty room that's no fun to play in. Yeah, it's sorry, you're still a legend, man. This is why it's I friggin' learning a lot, and I feel like I've been in this industry since 2005, and every time we have an interaction, I learn something. So thank you for that.
Appreciate it.
That's what
I'm
makes you a
glad
great
I went
educator.
into teaching.
Yeah, I mean, dude,
So
I think, you know what, you are incredible at design, but I think that teaching is probably the most noble pursuit you could possibly go for.
I love it. I've fallen in absolute love with it.
That's so good
There's
to hear.
something. I teach a course in environmental storytelling that I teach over J term. That's January. It's like a intensive 2 week term
So
where you meet
what's that
like
class
6 days
about?
a week. Um, have you seen John Wick, the John
Yes.
Wick films?
Hmm.
Okay. Do you know how in John Wick you've got this under society with the Continental Hotel and the tailor and the sommelier and the gold coins that are used as the currency and on the table and all of they never explain a goddamn thing about it. There's not a single moment of exposition. You absorb all of it by watching it happen in the environment.
Wow.
And my favorite example from movies is actually the first 35 minutes of Wall-E,
Hmm.
in which almost nobody speaks. There's like 20 words spoken in the course of that entire 35 minutes. But you learn what happened to Earth, where the people went, what was Wally's personality, Wally's job, Eve's personality, Eve's on down the line, almost entirely from environmental cues. Wally's relationship with that cockroach teaches you a lot about him. And so
Wow.
in games that do it well, like the 3 games that I use in the class, I use those 2 movies and Mad Max Fury Road because they come up with a whole religion that they never explain, but that you understand by the end of the film.
Yeah.
And there are also some great examples of planting and payoff in Mad Max Fury Road. But the games that I use are BioShock, Gone Home, which is a really good walking simulator where the environment builds the entire story. And my personal favorite, and it's a weird little game. Have you ever heard of a game called Unpacking?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
That's like a
I
Zen
was,
game, isn't it? Like a just
yeah, it's a
yeah.
Zen game, but you don't realize when you're playing it how much you're learning about the person while you're just unpacking their stuff. And the little things that they put in. My favorite example, and I'm sorry if I'm going to spoil it for you.
No, please, by all means, yeah.
My favorite example is, so unpacking, for those who don't know, is a game where you literally unpack. You start out in someone's bedroom when they're 13, and you unpack the boxes as they move into their own room, and then you unpack them when they move to college. Then you unpack them when they get their first apartment. Then you unpack them when they move in with a boyfriend. Then you unpack them when they when they break up with that boyfriend and move back home. Okay, and so they break up with the boyfriend, and there's hints when you're unpacking with the boyfriend. A lot of the boyfriend stuff can't be moved. You've got these tiny shelves. There's no place for you in his apartment for you to hang your diploma. You have to put it under the bed.
Really?
Okay. Yeah, which hints towards the relationship.
Yeah.
And then you're moving back into the house, and there's this photo that you had on a corkboard of the two of you together.
Yeah.
All right.
Huh.
You put the photo up on the corkboard, and the first thing that you notice is that the thumbtack is right through his face. But then it tells you that the corkboard that photo's in the wrong place. There's a red line about it. Every time you get done unpacking, it lets you know what's been put in the wrong. There's a lot of places you can put everything, but like if you put your toothbrush in the kitchen, it's going to tell you no. You have to figure out that no, it goes in the bathroom.
Yeah.
The game won't let you continue until you put that photo away in a drawer.
That's actually pretty powerful, actually.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a whole bunch of stuff like this.
That's amazing. That's actually really smart. Yeah,
the main character finds themselves in a much healthier relationship, and everything's movable. Unlike with the boyfriend, where it was clear that they had very different hobbies. You know, you're mixing a bunch of the same stuff together. Okay, wow. There's room for she moves in with you, if I remember correctly, the first time. Then you find your own place, but there's room for both people. Everything fits better.
Wow.
And so that subtle method of telling a story is hugely important in video games.
Well, sorry, go ahead.
Primarily because you don't know where the player is going to be, and so putting all of these hints in the environment. BioShock's the classic example. All the signs in Rapture and the signals you get into the environment that all this happened on New Year's Day, and I think 1959, and and what happened that you learned from the environment, and the fact that there was a revolt is something you learned through the environment, and all of this. This is hugely important in video games because that lets the player feel smart, lets the player discover things. Also, it means the developers have to have their story figured out, and most importantly, it means that the player gets to experience the story at their own rate. Okay, in their own way, as opposed to, and don't get me wrong. There's also games where exposition is necessary, but like the opposite end of that spectrum is your standard JRPG, where the story's laid out with lots of dialogue right away all the time. Okay,
and see, too many people forget the old adage of brevity is the soul of wit.
Exactly, especially me. I talk a lot, but
dude, keep talking because you're making my mind explode.
Yeah, I teach for a living, so I got to find a way to do it and get paid.
Hey,
but yeah. And so I teach this course in environmental storytelling, and the course actually ends in a 4-night, 3-day trip to Disneyland, because I've got a friend who's a former. Do you remember Scott Rogers from THQ?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I didn't know, but I know him.
Scott used to work as an Imagineer.
Ooh, that's cool.
Okay, and Scott gives us a guest lecture when we're in Anaheim, and then he gives a tour of Disneyland to the class, and they have an assignment where they need to find an example of environmental storytelling at Disneyland, and that helps drive it home.
That's really smart because a lot of the rides are that way.
Yeah, the lines in particular are. I can give you a 10-minute lecture on the line for web slingers and all the different stories that get told in it.
Yeah, if you would like to at some point, and we'll have you on again, or we can do it now, or whatever. Yeah.
But I realized I already knew this is what I wanted to do, but it really drove home the purpose of the class. It's designed to change the thought process of the student. It's designed to get them analyzing their media for environmental storytelling, because that's the first step towards incorporating it into your own work, is being able to recognize it.
I'm gonna
Yeah.
start calling you the video game Socrates, because that's pretty much what that is. Like you're asking, you're helping young. Because I don't know how much you knew about like Socrates in his life. He was adored by younger generations because of the way he taught, and mostly because of the way he disrupted people's ways of thinking. And you're doing that in game development, and I gotta say,
Yeah,
that's
it's
really
the
cool, man.
nicest things anyone said to me in weeks.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Well,
but I
hopefully
knew it
more
was
people say
working.
nicer things to you. So, but go on.
There we go. I knew it was work. There's no greater high. And look, I wear tie dye. I know that. Um,
Yeah.
there's no greater high than when a couple of the students from that class came up to me and said, "You son of a bitch." I'm like, "What's wrong?" I cannot look at a movie anymore without goddamn analyzing it for environmental storytelling. One of them was like, "I analyzed the elevator I was in." I was like, "Good, my job here is done."
Yeah, that's excellent.
Yeah, and so that I used to think the best professional feeling was when I watched somebody play my games. Now, I think the best professional feeling I've ever had
Hmm.
is watching somebody play one of my students' games and liking it.
That's gonna make you really proud.
Okay, so
Make you hella proud. Yeah. I mean, like,
oh yeah,
I have just a small taste of what you have as far as teaching goes. I've been contacted by people saying like, "Hey, thanks to QA Bootcamp, I got my job in QA. I'm actually able to get in the industry." And I know that feels really, really good. So I know a little bit about what you're talking about, and that's great. So that I am. Don't get me wrong. I think the game industry is you know lesser than for not having you as much in it anymore. But like the fact that you are doing the most noble profession, not only to sort of like set a little time of your time aside, a little your legend aside, to sort of inspire the next generation.
this is not. Thank you, but
Yeah, well,
this is not self-deprecating. Let me explain. I
I
think the games industry is better for me not being a designer,
think so.
and the reason is simply because I think I can make more of an impact by teaching an entire generation of developers.
Hmm. I see.
Okay.
Yeah, you're not only making that one great game, you're helping a
Yeah.
thousand students make their great games.
Yeah. I've got alumni that I've taught working on New World and God of War Ragnarok and a bunch of them at Volition because of our internship program. And all across, on the Five Nights at Freddy's VR game, on um
Sister location.
yeah, on a whole bunch of, I can't go down the list.
Right.
Um
But
And part of that problem is I'm spending a lot of my money buying my students' games. But
that But that's great, man. That's gonna make you so proud. And you know what? Like I said,
no,
the reason I call it the most noble profession is because you are kind of putting your own legacy aside to help others build theirs.
I respectfully disagree. I think my legacy is what is partially, it's more their legacy, but I think it's partly my legacy that they're successful,
Mm.
that you know, I call it living vicariously through them, but I've got a student that just got an internship at Insomniac,
Wow,
and I am so goddamn thrilled for her.
that's awesome.
Okay. Um, I've got another one that, didn't start learning VFX until they were in the master's program, and now they're working as a VFX artist.
Wow, they must have really taken to it.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. On down the, on down the line. And it's, the only thing that would make my job at Bradley perfect any better would be if it wasn't 100 miles from my house.
Yeah, I would say it probably makes it a little more difficult.
So
But so back to actually, I did want to talk about your humility for a second. Something that I struggle with, especially in the design thing, is because you almost have to be humble to be able to be open to all the ideas and all the input and everything like that. But at the same time, it can really kind of crush your sense of self-esteem sometimes to not have that confidence. Like, is there a balancing act there?
yeah, you've got to divorce your ego from the idea, because all too often you're going to have to cut something, or you're going to so on and so forth, and you're going to have to realize that what you're doing doesn't work. And that doesn't mean you're a bad designer. It doesn't mean you're a bad developer. It means you're trying to figure out fun, and that's subjective. And you can't, there's a lot of tools you can use. Develop a target audience, put together pillars, have define your goal before you define the solution you're putting into it, on down the line. But all that means is, how is it? Pillars of Eternity. If you ever read Blood, Sweat, and Pixels by Jason Schreier.
Yeah. Well, okay. I should say I started it. Sorry.
Yeah. When they're breaking down Pillars of Eternity, there's a great quote from one of the team members in there that says their design lead got the job because he's one of the smartest designers they've ever met. He gets it right the first time, almost 75% of the time.
That's pretty high.
Okay.
High percentage.
That's very high. Don't get me wrong. This guy's really good. But it's still only 75%.
Yeah, the fact that
that means that 25% of the time you got to back it up. Now, the other end of that is when you realize that you've got something good. You've got to do what Bianchi did with the magnet gun. You've got to know to champion it. You've got to know to push for it. You're not always going to succeed. You're not always going to. Not only are you not always going to be right, but you're not always going to push it through. Okay, don't get me wrong. But you've got to be able to recognize that and do that. There's a hold on. If I can.
No, yeah, it's fine. Take your time. I guess I can imagine it probably could crush you too if like you really, really push like Bianchi did. And I want to get Bianchi on here too because Bianchi's an incredibly talented individual too.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and he's.
Here we go.
I found a really weird way one time that he doesn't like hugs, especially not surprise hugs from behind.
Can I share my screen for a second?
Yes, please do. Absolutely.
Okay. This is the dichotomy of being a game designer. Okay, and the thing that people forget, because it says there's two types of game designers. The thing that you forget is they're the same person.
Yeah.
And you got to know when to be one and when to be the other.
That's hard.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's just pushing for that, and then like Bianchi did, and then not getting like if you pushed really that hard, you really believe something, it ended up not working. I guess you just kind of got to pick yourself up from that.
You've got to be. Sometimes you end up depressed and you go off for a bit and you got to pull yourself back together. Sometimes you just shrug your shoulders and go, time to go to the next one. And which one happens is based on a whole bunch of different features, a whole bunch of different factors that you can't predict. What's your mood that day? How important was this one feature to you? What's your base personality? Some people are more prone to one, some people are more prone to the other.
Yeah.
The important part is learn from it. One thing I tell my students, their job for the next 4 years is to fuck up.
That's a good message.
Okay? And what I tell them is I'm not going to grade them down for fucking up. I'm going to grade them down if they don't learn from it and if they repeat the same mistakes. I want them making new mistakes every time. Okay?
That's fair. That's really smart.
Yeah, that's the best way to learn. It requires some level of mental toughness, but it's still the best way to learn.
Well, and you're providing them that safe space too to fuck up.
Yeah, and I tell them I want to be the voice of reason. I don't want to be the one pushing them to do more. I want to be the one saying, "Are you sure?" Okay. I want them to get out there and try things and find out what's going on.
It's funny. A lot of your lessons are like part and parcel with being a good parent. Even just creating that safe space for your kids to fuck up.
Yeah, and there's a lot of that to it.
Really cool. I mean, and thankfully, the industry is definitely steeped in rejection. Like, there's a lot of rejection in this industry.
Yeah, and there's a lot of people that don't know how to give constructive criticism or how to give rejection the right way. So that it's not so hurting. And there's a lot of that. And there's a lot of, to be blunt, there's a lot of people that think they know what they're doing and don't.
God, ain't that the truth?
That's painful. But there's also some of the most creative people I've ever met. The most creative people I've ever met in my life are in the game industry.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's
Some
pretty
of the
great.
coolest people. I used to do a lot of live theater.
Really? I didn't
And
know that about you.
yeah. Um, and working on games, that's the one thing I miss. Though that's one of the things I miss. There's things, don't get me wrong, I love what I'm doing, but I miss some stuff from the old career.
Yeah.
And one of them is that being in the trenches, you've only got your friends to count on. You got to get it right. Feel that builds so much camaraderie and such strong bonds between people.
hmm
Um,
And that's why I'm so torn on crunch culture because yeah, crunch shouldn't be a thing. Like I mean, it's going to be a thing no matter what. But because there's a product and there's a deadline, that's sort of just the way it
yeah.
goes. But there's that crunch culture of like yeah, people shouldn't have to crunch and all that stuff. But when you go through that with the group of people, you have a camaraderie, like a brother, a kinship.
There's a cost. Okay. There's a difference between crunch and crunch culture.
hmm Yeah, that's
Crunch
fair.
culture is what we had at Microsoft, although I understand it's much better now. I'm not slamming Microsoft currently. But that was the 3 years of 70 to 80 hours. The most I worked in 1 week was 104.
Oof,
And I was not the person who worked the most that week. There were
goddamn.
other people that worked more hours than me that week. Um,
There's only so many
that
hours
the
in the week,
problem
damn
with
it.
the problem with crunch culture is it starts assuming you're going to work that many hours every week, and it starts being scheduled for that many hours every week, and you are judged if you don't work that many hours every week. Now
Hmm.
compare that to my favorite example is you've been working 40 to 50 hours a week. I consider 50 a normal work week, but that's because I'll also do things like run D&D during lunch and play a bunch of Magic at the office. And so I'm also getting some of my entertainment time
hmm
while I'm there.
Yeah.
Um, and so, but picture, you've been working 40 to 50-hour weeks for a year and a half, 2 years, whatever. And then you find out that all of a sudden you've got a booth at E3, but you only got 2 weeks to come up with a demo. And so they come to you and they say, "Can you, for these 2 weeks, work extra hours?" I'm pulling a number out of my ass. Can
Yeah.
you, for these 2 weeks, work extra hours to get the demo up and running? Okay, that's the difference in my view between crunch and crunch culture. Crunch culture is an expectation that you will always be working more, and that burns you out. I honestly think that working at that 3 hour period is what caused me to get diabetes.
I don't
Okay,
doubt it.
that level of constant stress hormone.
hmm
Now, the difference between that and very rare occasional crunch, that is for a specified amount of time, for a specific goal,
hmm
okay? And I don't mean, and I've had this sentence said to me, go say goodbye to your families because you're not going to see them for the next 9 months until the game's done. All
Yeah.
right. I remember that conversation. Um, Instead, it's we have this easily measurable goal
hmm
that's going to take this much time of working extra hours to make it in schedule. All right. Is that good? No, but that's the part that I think is a necessary part of being a creative team where you
hmm
can't predict how long it's going to take to do everything when you've got a schedule.
Yeah.
Um, and you don't go to that until you've gone to corporate and asked for more time, or you've gone to the bosses and asked for more time, or you've taken a look and seen what you can cut from the project. There's anything you can cut without losing, because almost every game can afford to, at some point in their development, cut a bunch of features without making the game worse. In fact, it
Right.
makes the game better because then you've got more time to spend on the important core features. You do all of that first. Don't get me wrong, but there comes a time where even a good set of bosses is going to go, we've got no more time to give. Okay. Where
hmm
even a good set of bosses is, we can't afford to bring more people on, and it's late enough in the project, or even if we did, they wouldn't get up to speed in time. Um, and that this is something that can't be cut. And so, and there's people who disagree with me. There's people that say all crunch is evil. Okay. And there's people that say that crunch culture is the way the industry works and goddamn deal with it.
Mm.
Okay. And I
I used to be in that camp until I realized, until I got old enough to like, wait, this is destroying people's lives. You know, this is not good.
No, I stopped bowing to crunch culture when my kids were, because I realized that I was going to miss out on so much with.
Absolutely.
Um,
Yeah.
and so,
Thank you for
yeah,
that. Like, I had not actually considered that sort of, juxtaposition between those two things. That's interesting. So cool. You kind of whenever you're talking about environmental storytelling, which I'm still thinking about a lot now. Thanks.
cool.
It's really wow. So like I try to be a student of design as much as I can, and that's just something I have. Like I've always thought about, like, sort of like it's Fallout whenever you see characters like laying around, like skeletons with a gun in their hands, stuff like that. That's little stuff, but like going so deep as to like, that thing in unpacking kind of blows my mind that they literally will not let you move on until you've moved on, until you've taken the picture,
Exactly.
put it away.
And it's, oh, I was playing it with the class, because the class is taught online until we all go to Disney, um, because they're all over the place at this point. But it's January; they're all back at home,
Mhm.
and so I'm playing it online, and we're talking about it and analyzing it as I play. And so we got done with that section, and we moved on to another part of the class, which I call 10-minute exercises. I'll show them 10 minutes of a movie with the sound off of an obscure film.
Mhm.
That has good environmental storytelling, and they have to tell me what they can figure out about the movie.
That's a good exercise.
Um, and so we moved on to that. But when we moved on to it, they were like, when we're done with class, can you play the rest of Unpacking?
That's funny, but that's great. That just shows how good of a game can communicate
is
that way.
it's such If you get one thing from this podcast, just go get Unpacking and play it.
I think it's on Game Pass, isn't it?
Yeah, it's on Game Pass. I own it. I bought it on Steam, but
Mm.
it is definitely on Game Pass. They went and found it there, and a bunch of the students played it that night.
I'm gonna play the shit out of that
Um,
tonight, dude.
it only takes like 3 hours to get through.
Oh, okay. Oh, it's easy. It's supposed to
Okay,
be
it's a
very
short.
relaxing Zen game too. So
It's a short, relaxing Zen game, but pay attention to the little things in it, to how some of the stuff gets older and weathered, and so you get to see which things are being used, about the different collections that she puts together, about how her hobbies change over time, and then in some cases how they change back.
Hmm.
Okay.
Very cool. Yeah, I'll definitely check
And
that out.
yeah,
That reminds me of something called I'm not sure if I'm saying it right, called verisimilitude. It's something that I think it's the director of the reason I got the word, I kind of stole it from the director of the original Superman movie, to where he said that everything that exists in the world has to make sense.
verisimilitude is like everything has to appear real. Okay. And
Mm.
that's you can believe you can say here's the 7 impossible things you need to believe to get into this story. But the story needs to be internally consistent with those 7 impossible things.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Pacific Rim's one of my favorite films.
Fun.
Okay. But let's be, because what can I say? I'm both a kaiju and a giant robot fan. Um, but let's be honest. If these giant monsters somehow attack the Earth,
Mhm.
the dumbest way to fight them is making 300-foot tall robots. But
Yeah.
you accept that at the beginning, and then you need to stay internally consistent about their effectiveness, about their usage, about how they work.
Hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
In order for it to be real. Because if all of a sudden they decide that actually all the robots can fly,
Yeah, it'll be
that's
very
going to
jarring.
break. Yeah, that's going to cause your suspension of disbelief to break its shocks. And so,
Well, and that's actually one of the things that took me. Like, don't get me wrong, I really like the movie. I only seen it once, and I don't want to see it again, because I like it so much. Inception. That one of the things that kind of I didn't like about that movie is they set up the rules of the kick of, like, you fall over and it wakes you up, but then it doesn't work later in the movie.
yeah, you've got to be consistent to your own rules if you want verisimilitude.
Yeah.
And I have no idea if that's the right way to pronounce it either.
Yeah. Say
Um,
we'll just both roll with it.
yeah.
But
You've got to stay to that level of internal. Like, now don't get me wrong, there are successful franchises that don't. Like my favorite, Star Trek.
mhm.
Star Trek: The Next Generation was famous for coming up with this technological solution in this episode and never goddamn using it again, despite the fact that it was useful. They figured out a way to phase the Enterprise through solid matter and never used it again. Okay.
Seems like you should write that down.
Yeah, they constantly redefine how the transporter works so they can use it as a plot device. And that, it works for them. And I love, don't get me wrong, I love Star Trek.
I guess you could love something and sort of like see the flaws of its logic and stuff like that. So there is one last question I have for you, and I haven't asked anybody else yet, but I kind of had my mind blown by somebody else a while back, and they taught me a really important design lesson. And the lesson, just in case anybody's interested, is I thought that you should always make every single part of the game as best as you possibly can. But then he taught me, he's like, no, you want it to be consistent. Because if you got like the side activity that's super duper fun and it's like super awesome, and then you finish it and then you go back to the rest of the game, you're not going to want to finish. That blew my mind. But the reason is kind of crazy is I learned this lesson from an animator. Like, it wasn't even a designer. So I guess my question for you is, have you ever learned a lesson from just like out of left field? You totally did not expect to learn it from that place.
Give me a second.
Yeah, take your time. Take your time.
A bunch of times, yes.
Just always hard to come up with one. Do it now.
It's always hard to come up with,
on demand. But yeah, and don't get me wrong. Like, I can always edit this. Like, if we have long lulls, I can just edit them out. Not a problem.
I appreciate it.
Yeah.
I don't know. It was my stepfather who taught me the importance of trying to get your work done right. But to get to a more professional level.
I think that's a really good, important thing, because you see too many people that say they have get it done over get it done right.
Yeah. The importance of the right idea, the importance of not having an ego about your own stuff was taught to me by improv.
That'll do it.
Yeah, improv, the first rule of improv is yes and.
Mm-hmm.
Is when someone says something, you don't say, no, that's not true. You go with it, because that makes the bit better. All right?
Yeah.
That rule from improv theater, I find vastly important in game development. It's not, you should rarely, if ever, say, that's a terrible idea. All right. Even if you don't like it, the question is, you look at it and you go, okay, I think you got some points here and here, but have you thought about this?
So you're yes-anding their idea.
Exactly. You're yes-anding their idea, because very, very rarely, there's a quote from the West Wing. It says, very rarely is there a situation that's black and white.
Mm-hmm.
And those, this is President Bartlett talking, he goes, and they almost always involve body counts. Thankfully, that's not true in game development. But very rarely is there a situation where an idea is only good or only bad. It's always a mix of, do the benefits outweigh the negatives? Do the benefits outweigh the costs? And so you look and see, what will this give me? What does this cost me? I was talking with some of my students earlier. They're making a 3D first-person shooter roguelike. Okay, this is my master's students. Okay, that's the game they're working on. It's called Chronoclasm. Buy it. It's not. They're out.
No, it's fine. Friggin' yeah.
But they're working on a 3D first-person shooter roguelike. We were talking about it today, and they had they're trying to get people in closer for combat. And they have a time stop mechanic, and they're trying to get that used more by the player. And so they were talking about, and they want more running guns. So they were talking about putting in a shield mechanic. I was like, well, what does that give you? And they said, well, it makes them more prone to be able to jump out from behind things without losing health. I'm like, yeah, that's true. How's they going to regenerate? Well, it's going to regenerate over time. So what's going to happen is they're going to jump out, lose a bunch of shields, and then duck back around a corner and wait for it to recharge. Is that the gameplay you want? Okay. And so we went back and forth and figured out some changes and stuff. And I'm simplifying, because this was a 45-minute conversation.
Right.
I'm simplifying the whole thing. There was a bunch more back and forth and stuff, but I think that's that's a better way to approach than, well, actually, shields are a stupid idea.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's a much better way of doing it because like you didn't insult them, you didn't say it was a bad idea. You basically just said, "Hey, these are the problems you might face. Is
Yeah.
that cool with you?" kind of thing.
Yeah, and it wasn't a bad idea. It didn't. The problem was it didn't match all their goals.
It's a good point.
Okay, it's that simple. It didn't. That's why I say define the goal before defining the solution. All too often, I mean, you've seen this probably 1,000 times. This is broken. Let's try that. Okay, okay, but it should be. This doesn't work. Well, how
Hmm.
do we want it to behave? Okay, how can we get to that behavior?
See, and
Um,
that's something that like I like to follow Masahiro Sakurai. He's the guy who makes Smash Brothers and Kirby and all that stuff. And he has a really good YouTube channel. And one of the things that he said in his was a lot of times designers will look at something like, all right, I want to discourage this activity, but really what you want to also look at what do I want them to do and how do I encourage that?
the carrot is much better than the stick for the vast majority of games.
Agreed, agreed.
Um, you know, if you're making a shooter, the stick is automatic. You lose health.
Hmm. Yeah.
But the important part is, it's rather than taking something away from the player, it's better to give them a series of choices and they get to keep one, okay, and then the others happen to fall by the wayside. That's one of the reasons why I love roguelikes or the newer trend that started with Vampire Survivors of the anti-bullet hell games.
That's awesome.
Okay. Oh, have you played Brotato?
No.
Oh, play Brotato.
Looking it up now.
Um,
Hell yeah, dude.
it's a much purer distillation of the core gameplay
Purer
that
than Vampire
Vampire Survivors
Survivors?
developed.
Wow. That's pretty simple. If I say
Well, what Brotato does is you make your way through 20 waves, and in between each wave you get to buy things.
oh, okay.
And so you play, 30-second wave, buy your upgrades. 35-second wave, buy your upgrades. Boom, 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 boom.
Hmm.
And you get to select your difficulty levels as you go up. And so it's a much purer. I found lately I want one of two things in my games. I either want an amazing story or I want a pure distillation of gameplay.
And you know what, touching on what you said before was really smart is like a good story can also basically include just as much of what's not said as of what is said.
So
Yeah, but
ah,
I do have one last thing I do want to tell
go
you
for it.
before we break this off. You have a reputation for having like one of the best laughs in game design. Yeah, exactly. Like people can't hear it on the recording, but I remember at Volition, you would be like on another floor, and I swear we could hear you. And it was a joyful laugh. So I want to say one last thing to you is thank you for, if nothing else, having an incredible laugh that brightened everybody's day.
I think it comes with the name because my favorite laugh is Dave Samuels,
Okay.
if you remember him.
Mm-mm.
Um,
Mm-mm.
he may have been bright, no, but thank you. I'm
Yeah, you're
very
welcome, man.
proud. I'm very proud of. I like my laugh. I think it helps make other. I
It's
think it
great.
helps with the world.
It does,
So
and when people hear you laughing, they're like, "Oh, something tickled Abzug, man." It's a good day, you know. But yeah, thank you so much for coming, man. I really appreciate you joining. I took up so much of your time.
pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, man. All right, I'll see you.
See ya.